Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. I get often the question that what happens in a situation when my opponent captures one of my pieces and I have the option to recapture in 2, 3 or more different ways. How do I know which is the correct recapture? It's a very common situation, and in this lesson I would like to show a number of examples that deals with such situations. I have to say that there is no golden rule that it's always with the pawn or the queen or such, but it depends always on the exact situation. Generally, you can use common sense. First of all, you would want to choose the recapture that avoids any kind of loss of material. And then second of all, there may be strategical rules of thumbs that you need to follow, such as typically you would not want to double up your pawns, which means that you wouldn't want the result to be your two pawns being on the same file, if you can help it, of course, and also still avoid losing material. Or, for example, if you have a king castled, you'd generally want to keep your 3 pawns in front of your king and do not open up any file in front of your king. So there are such and similar rules of thumbs that you want to follow, but each specific situation has its own characteristics that you specifically and concretely need to look at. Let's start with our first example in this lesson. And the position we see right now, materially speaking, is even, as you can tell. The only materially speaking difference in the position is that black has a bishop, while white has a second knight compared to black. But as we know, the bishop and the knight are approximately of equal value. So this is an interesting position, and we'll come back to this starting position, but for the time being, let's talk a little bit about what happens if now white captures on c6. And indeed, we have in front of us one of those crossroads situations when black has in fact 4 different ways to capture white's knight, with a queen, rook, bishop or the pawn. All of them remove the white knight from the board and, at least temporarily, maintain the material balance. So how would you know which one to choose? First of all, you want to look at the most natural looking move to you. To me, the most natural looking move would be to capture with the bishop. But you may wonder, why is that? Well, there are 2 reasons for it. For one, if you remember the position here, we saw that all of a sudden, because of white's last move, the black bishop has been attacked by the white rook due to the discovery that got created by white's last move. So that's for one, you'd want to move the bishop away from that. And then, second of all, when the bishop gets to c6, it looks pretty nice on the longest diagonal of all and immediately aiming towards white's pawn on g2. So looks-wise, this would be the first idea I would have. However, then it's very important to try to predict or foresee your opponent's next best move that you can see. And then I would see rather quickly that white now would have a killer move, namely moving the queen up to e6, which isn't only a check to black's king, but it is also at the same time attacking black's rook on c8. And we can tell that this is serious trouble, because black will be forced to answer the check, which means in this case we'll need to move the king out of the check, and then the white queen will be free to capture the black rook on c8. So in this case we can conclude that the bishop capturing back after knight takes knight on c6 is out of question, even though it looks like a natural response because of the fork with the queen. Then we should look what are second most natural choice. Before I tell you what it is to me, let me point out that basically, kind of by the method of elimination, black does not have any other choice than the correct one. Because, as I mentioned earlier, if now the black pawn captures, the bishop on d7 will get in trouble, in fact, will be captured right away for free. And the same would happen if, after knight takes knight on c6, black now captures back with the rook. Then again, the bishop remains unprotected on d7, and white simply won a piece. So therefore, going back to the starting position, after knight takes knight, and when the black queen captures back on c6, that's the only correct move. Reason? That it protects the bishop on d7. So generally our number one priority is to make sure we don't lose material, or of course even better if we can win material with our moves. And that of course comes only behind avoiding any checkmate situations, of course, that would you'd be getting checkmate, or if you'd be giving checkmate, that of course is a good thing. So in this case, queen takes back on c6, and the position is quite reasonable for black. At least materially speaking, it's even, and there isn't any immediate tragedy. Even though, let me just show you a couple more moves. White can try some attacking moves, such as moving the queen immediately to e7, attacking that same bishop a second time. But the black bishop could move away simply to e6, away from the attack. And now, after white would resume with knight h5, which looks like a rather dangerous move, threatening to checkmate right away with queen g7, then black would make a very tricky move, a very important move, playing bishop to f7. And now, if white continues the attack with rook d7, which would be now attacking the black bishop a second time, then of course not bishop capturing on h5, when white would checkmate right away, but again continuing the defense with queen g6, protecting the bishop a second time, and after knight f4, which aims to chase the queen away from the bishop, of course the queen will go to a square where it still maintains the protection of the bishop, and black would be okay. Let's go back to the very beginning of this position, and I just wanted to point out that actually the best move right now for white is not to trade the knights, but rather to play knight e6, which is a pretty strong attacking move because it opens up the d file, so now the bishop is under attack, and also the knight is aiming towards the defense of the black king. Now, when the bishop would move away, then the second knight could come to f5, and black would have serious difficulties with the pawn in front of his king. Of course, if that pawn would move forward, that would mean the other pawn on h6 would be lost. So, in other words, black is in a serious situation. Let's move on to our second example in this lesson. Here we are. In this position, for a change, it was black's turn, and black captured, rook captures, rook on d4. Prior to this move, we had a completely even material balance. Right now, at the moment, of course, black is up a rook, but this is very temporary because white has the option to recapture on d4. In fact, white has a choice of 3 different ways to do so. Here again, we should think what would be the most natural way to recapture. Well, just like what I would like to see, I would like to see either my bishop or my knight centralized on d4. However, oftentimes what we'd like to see, or what's most natural, is being overridden by circumstances and by need, in this case, to avoid losing material. For example, capturing back with the pawn, strategically speaking, would be my least favorite choice because it would result the white pawn getting onto an isolated file. But that means that now the white pawn doesn't have a neighbor on either side. There is no white pawn on the C file or on the E file. So that's called an isolated pawn. And generally that's not a good thing, because when an isolated pawn is being attacked, targeted, it's hard to defend it. So, generally speaking, this would be my last choice. However, in this case, the circumstances dictate that it's my only choice. Why? Because if alternatively white would capture with a knight on d4, that would allow black to capture white's pawn on h2. And that's certainly no fun. To start with, white is losing a pawn, but then again the king will be also attacked, so there will be further loss beyond this one pawn. So that's out of question. Now let's talk about the bishop capturing on d4. Well, this looks like a better choice because now the white knight still maintains protection on the h2 square. However, it's still not so simple. The problem is that black can trade rooks first, giving white no choice, but move the knight back, capturing black's rook, and then again we're at the same problem, queen captures h2. So what did we see in this example after rook d4? That even though we'd prefer not to capture to d4 with a pawn, we'd prefer to maintain a nice chain of pawns on the queen side, the problem is that by capturing on d4 with either of the two minor pieces, let it be the white knight or bishop, white will lose at least one pawn on h2, and therefore it is a priority not to lose material and rather ruin a little bit the pawn structure. It's very important to understand the priorities in chess. Generally, in 99% of the time, if your choice is to make a little bit of strategical problem for yourself, like ruining a pawn structure or giving up your pair of bishops or something like that, you'd rather do that than live with permanent damage, which would be material loss, like losing a piece or usually even losing a little pawn. Let's move on to our next example in this lesson. Here we are. So right now, what do we see here? Just like in the previous two examples, we do have material balance. And at this moment, white captured, bishop takes f6. So if you're playing with the black pieces, I'd like to ask you, what would be your most natural response right now? One that uses common sense and avoids any loss of material. Well, I'm hoping your response was to capture back with the rook. And let's look at it why. Well, capturing back with the queen actually would look good if it wouldn't have a serious flaw, namely that it allows the white rook to capture on e8, black's rook, and not only that it captures the rook, but it immediately checkmates black's king. So here we can simply actually use the method of elimination. And then also capturing back with the pawn, this is the scenario that I was referring to when I was mentioning that generally when you have your king in a castle position, as we've seen here, you do not want to open up, move a pawn, one of the three pawns in front of the king, away. Like right now the G file is open, so if white could create an attack with the queen or the rooks, or of course together the two, that certainly is not an improvement in black's position. Also, the other problem is that black with that pawn recapture would double up the pawns on the f file and isolate the f and the h pawns, so even strategically speaking, it's not a good thing. Now again, it would be your choice if that's the only way to recapture, or otherwise you would lose material. But here, as we said, capturing with the rook on f6 avoids any kind of loss of material, and the position would be just fine for black. Now there is actually one more alternative that black can choose. Although my top choice would be capturing right away with the rook on f6, it is possible to first make an intermediate check by capturing white's rook. Of course, white is in check, therefore they don't have the time to capture black's queen, and when white rooks recapture, then again black still has the same three choices of recapturing, the queen, rook or pawn, and still the best option is to recapture with the rook. Capturing with the queen would still be suicidal because it would still allow the back rank checkmate with rook e8. And capturing back with the pawn would also be clearly inferior to the other better option, capturing with the rook, as for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. Okay, so we understand this. Let's move on to our next example in this lesson. And in this position, white traded rooks on d7. And again, black has a dilemma which way to recapture. An experienced player immediately would know not even to think of recapturing with the king. Typically, as soon as there are queens still on the board, you would not want to move your king towards the middle of the board, which certainly it would be if the black king would capture. Now, in this case, there is actually an immediate punishment if black still would do so, namely by pinning the black queen, and that would be a major material gain for white. So that's out of question. You shouldn't even think about it, even for the principal reason of not moving the king towards the middle of the board as long as there are queens still in the play. As I said, the only time you would look at it if that's your only way to recapture the rook, or at least try to avoid losing material. Now, the most natural move would be to recapture with the rook, because then the rook still would maintain the open file. But this has also a serious problem. Similarly to the king recapture, here also white would play bishop to b5, and then again it skewers up the black queen and rook. So what happens here is, even though, unlike after the king recapture, here the queen can move, but nevertheless it will result material loss after the white bishop captures the rook on d7. So therefore, again, we kind of used the method of elimination. There is only one reasonable move that avoids losing material, and that is queen captures rook. Now black maintained the material balance, and after white playing bishop b5, it is only the queen that's being attacked. The queen can pretty much move to many squares, any square where it will not be losing material. For example, could go to d5, or could go to d4 or d6, where the queen is protected by one of the other pieces. Let's move on, see our next example. Here we are. In this endgame, it was white's turn, and let's first look what happens after knight d5. In this position again, black has two options to recapture the knight. Generally speaking, when your opponent captures one of your pieces, and hopefully you were prepared for it, the first thing you should look at, how can you in turn capture your opponent's piece? Now here again, the common sense would clearly dictate for black to recapture with the rook. Why is that? Because if you would capture instead with a pawn on d5, that would result the black pawn getting isolated. So that is a problem in itself. However, in this case it's even worse because it opens up the c file and now allows the white rook to move to c7, and that's certainly an unpleasant thing from black's perspective. When a rook gets to the 7th rank, it's dangerous for the other side typically because the rook is aiming at a number of pawns all at once and usually forces the other side to defense. It also cuts out the black king from getting involved in the game to get towards the center and gives white a free hand to get roaming with his own king. So for these reasons, after knight takes d5, pawn takes is pretty much not a good choice. Therefore, as we said, it's best to capture back with the rook, and now, in fact, black controls the only open file. Going back to the beginning position, therefore, it's better actually for white to play rook d1, which creates a pin. Now black cannot capture the white knight safely because then the rook would be lost. White would capture the rook with a check and then on the next move the knight. Of course, nobody forces the black knight to do that, and black should just bring the king towards the middle of the board. As we know in endgames, unlike in the opening or the middle game, the king should be an active participant and usually is best positioned around the middle of the board. Here, white should go ahead and try to trade and still create an isolated pawn for black. Now, if rook c1, with the idea to again come in on the open file to the 7th rank, black can play rook d7 and with correct defense should be able to save this game. And now let's see our final example in this lesson. Here we are. This is an equal position with relatively symmetrical pawn structure, both rooks on each side occupying open files. So let's talk about some exchanges here. For example, if white captures on d8, black needs to be very careful, because if they simply recapture on d8, that would allow the white rook coming in to e7 and with a check, and then capture one of black pawns. On the other hand, if black plays correctly, capturing the rook on e1, that is checking the white king, and doesn't leave white the time to play rook d7 and win one of the pawns. The king has to get out of the check, and now black has the time to come back to the 7th rank and prevent the white rook getting there first. The same scenario would happen if white would start by capturing the other rook. Again, black should not recapture on e8 because then the white rook comes down to d7, but should capture the other rook, checking white's king again. After king g2, black can choose to come back to d7 like we saw in the previous variation, or it is even safe to play king f6 because now the rook cannot go to e7 because the black king controls that square, and if the rook would try to attack from the back, the black pawns, then the black rook could come back to d7, protect on b7, and be just fine, an approximately equal position. Well, I hope you enjoyed these interesting examples about exchanges and captures, and you got perhaps a better understanding on when to recapture and how and why. Generally use common sense. You want to make sure you avoid loss of material or avoid creating a permanent weakness in your position. Oftentimes you simply use the method of elimination, that if option A, B and C doesn't work, you just go with option D that doesn't lose material or doesn't ruin your pawn structure, for example. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back with more chess ideas in the next lesson. Bye-bye.